Hello, everyone. I'm Felicity Gerry, Queen's Counsel. That means I'm a barrister in chambers in Melbourne, in Australia, and also at Libertas Chambers in London. I'm Professor of Legal Practice at Deakin University, and I'm an honorary professor at Salford University. I work internationally. Generally, my cases involve homicide, terrorism, war crimes, modern slavery, and some major litigation with human rights issues, including things like reparations for historic slavery. I teach contemporary international legal issues. I often try and have a focus in relation to women. So the current unit I'm teaching is terrorism, national security, with a focus on national security and women in terrorism. And the unit that I'm going to be teaching in July is on international art law, organised crime, and the digital marketplace. So I suppose you'd say I'm a woman of many talents, or at least trying to be. I'm absolutely delighted to speak for the campaign for a Women's Bill of Rights. I think it is absolutely so important. Obviously, I can only speak from my own perspective, but I gave you that slightly long introduction to myself, just for you to see perhaps how widely I've had to spread myself in order to achieve recognition as Queen's Counsel and a professor. So I wholeheartedly support the campaign for a Women's Bill of Rights, not just as a woman, but also as a lawyer. I recognise, of course, that CEDAW has been a powerful instrument, but in the UK, which is the perspective that I'm speaking about today, it really isn't enough. There is no clear constitutional protection in the UK, and of course, no Bill of Rights. And what those things could do, constitutional protection, a Bill of Rights that is recognised as having constitutional protection, is to give proactive dignity and respect to women and about women's issues. Mostly I'm speaking to you today as a criminal lawyer, and my areas of specialism are international and domestic criminal law, if that wasn't already obvious. And that gives me a unique insight as a bit of a hybrid, part academic and part practitioner. I think I'm known as a pracademic. I think that's what they call us, which allows me to consider research as well as practice as an advocate in the criminal courts in relation to serious offences. And it seems to me, certainly as a researcher, an examination of history, literature and law shows two things. Women are not visible as jurists, and women's issues are not visible, or at least both of those things not as visible as they should be. So what do I mean by that? Well, women not visible as jurists, there is simply not enough, there isn't equality of women as lawyers and as judges. It has improved, of course, but there is a lack of women in positions of power and responsibility, particular lack of senior women. And for example, the list that I'm on of counsel at the International Criminal Court, to which the UK makes a significant contribution, of the list of counsel, 17% are women. And they're mostly lawyers who are younger than me, which means that women are seen, certainly in international criminal law, as a service industry for senior men. And if you look at the numbers across the legal profession where I'm at, certainly at the Bar of England and Wales, the numbers are also problematic, certainly at my level. It's quite rare to see, still quite rare to see a woman silk. And of course, numbers are improving, but it's not equal on the bench and it's not equal at the bar. We do, of course, now have some sense of equality at the Old Bailey. But I just want you to think for a moment about the publicity that we had recently in relation to the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Plane loads of women judges having to be rescued from Afghanistan at risk from the Taliban, women in all sorts of positions and power and responsibility, and particularly young women career judges, young women with families having to get on a plane and escape, we would not have the same image. We might well, and God forbid that ever happened in the UK, but we might well be able to identify women judges on that Exodus, that imaginary plane. I hope it would be. But we wouldn't necessarily have the level of diversity that the Afghanistan women had. So I think it's really important not to assume that the UK is doing things well, and not to react to overseas countries as doing these issues of equality less well than the UK. The UK capable of being a leader in this area, but not achieving as much as it should. And in fact, being overtaken by a number of countries across the globe. And what do I mean by women's issues as not visible? Well, we know women as victims, there are some appalling statistics, absolutely appalling statistics, for example, of the number of women who die from domestic violence each year. Certainly in the 26 years that I've been a barrister, I can remember when it was really difficult to bring a prosecution for an offence where a woman was a victim, particularly if it was a woman who was a sex worker, for example. A lot of prejudice against particular women in particular employment. Often we've seen women being wrongly prosecuted. We can think of all those terrible cases where women are falsely accused of killing their children, or they've killed their abusive partner, and the issue of provocation or coercive control has not been properly considered. I currently represent posthumously Christine Keeler through a brief from her son, and she was prosecuted despite being a victim of violence, and there was no dispute that she was the victim of violence. She was prosecuted for an alleged lie about who was present when she was the subject of violence, not about being the subject of violence, but about who was there at the time. Shocking decision. And we can think about how she's been portrayed in the media ever since. We can also think about women as defendants. So women who are accused of crime, for me, particularly interesting areas, not just coercive control, but also trafficked women who commit crime. And only last week, I was successful on an appeal for a woman 1,414 days out of time when she had been wrongly convicted, where she was a victim of human trafficking, and that had not been properly picked up in the system. Fortunately, there's a system now that the Court of Appeal can quash those convictions. But there are no doubt thousands of women who've been in prison and who are in prison who have been wrongly prosecuted and wrongly convicted. And even where they have committed crime, have significant vulnerabilities. And certainly when I did a 4-year project on women in prison, the level of vulnerability that we see of women in prison is absolutely shocking. And I'm sure many of you know of and work in areas where very vulnerable women are not supported, often losing their children along the way in circumstances that you could quite easily describe as duress of circumstances, or indeed direct duress through threats to themselves. So as I say, as Queen's Counsel, I see very few women silks in court with me. We lose a lot of women along the way. The profession, as far as I'm concerned, has failed to address these issues. Plainly, discrimination laws are not sufficient, certainly in the context of law. Often I walk into a court building and the first question I'm asked is whether I'm a juror. And I have to say to the security, no, women are barristers too. And they always apologise, but it says something about the societal attitude that lawyers are still seen as men. And I think one thing that a Bill of Rights can do is really start to move societal attitude towards dignity and respect for women. We still celebrate women's appointments in law, and that's because it's not the norm. Of course, I love to celebrate all those fantastic women that do manage to hang on and get on, but it remains not the norm. And in the last 7 murder trials that I've done in England and Wales, I haven't got the exact calculation, but there were over 60 judges and barristers in those trials. And in most of those cases, I was the only woman. One of those cases, there was one other female QC, and in another one of those cases, I led another woman. And I feel it's a real sense of responsibility for me to carry on doing what I'm doing so that women behind me can see that they can stay on and become senior members of our profession. But I genuinely think a Bill of Rights can move the conversation, the attitudes towards women a long way. I find myself regularly having to raise issues of misogyny. I've also been accused of having an agenda or being oversensitive, which is perhaps an argument for another day, but it just shows you how entrenched the attitudes are. Before checking themselves, people are quick to accuse. And I think we need a framework that allows us to understand the equality that's necessary for women in the UK. Obviously, we also have to deal with everyday sexism and misogyny in publicity, in the media, a range of tropes. Christine Keeler is the perfect example, never in a newspaper without she's naked on a chair. But there are other examples in my practice. I do a lot of work around female genital mutilation and research in the context of health, law and education. And sadly, the first described as successful prosecution in England and Wales involved a mother. And whilst the practice of FGM is horrifying and needs to be eradicated, and there is a lot of great work being done, the campaigns in which I've been involved in England and Wales are superb, across the UK, in fact. That prosecution involved allegations of witchcraft. So we still, in the 21st century, have trials where there is evidence of witchcraft. Now, it may be that there's a trial where witchcraft is used as a context to abuse. But in this case, the witchcraft that was apparently admissible in that trial related to spells that were being cast on police officers investigating. I can't see the relevance of that. And it's pretty shocking to see women framed in that way in the 21st century. Another example, a case that I was involved in intervening, very contentious case of Shamima Begum, a groomed young woman who went to Syria and has now been stripped of her citizenship, where we have not made any findings in relation to her traffic status, but more importantly, we have not brought her back to face a prosecution if she's engaged in any activity. And the decision to stay the proceedings, nothing goes ahead for the time being, it ignores, in my view, the current constitutional arrangements. That means that a nation state has responsibility for its subjects, including its women. My view is there's a responsibility to go and fetch our subjects and protect those who need protecting and prosecute those who need prosecuting and work out which one is which. So we live in a world where our constitutional arrangements, such as they are for women, are ignored. And the headlines in relation to that case are never going to be about constitutional arrangements, but they could be if we had a Bill of Rights for women guaranteeing those important protections, most of which are set out in CEDAW, so it's not rocket science to copy. And many countries across the world now have instruments attached to their written constitutions that provide those types of protections against arbitrary or oppressive, particularly government action, but also action by corporates, so that we can have that noble expression and shield of human dignity for women. I don't think I can add to the campaign any more than that. I've deliberately chosen to tell you some stories because that's what barristers do, and to get you thinking about all those difficult cases that I appear in, and then stop and think that if I'm not there and women are not there and women's issues are not understood or identified and not protected through a Women's Bill of Rights, then what is going on in all those other courts that I'm not in? Many people would say it's a lot better than it was. It plainly isn't good enough. And unless we have the sort of Bill of Rights that's being suggested in this campaign, the movement for women will be as slow as it has been, and in some contexts non-existent. So I hope you've enjoyed listening to me. I pop up fairly often in other people's podcasts, so it's been quite interesting for me to speak to you all myself. I'm relatively easy to contact if anyone wants to get in touch through my chambers, Libertas Chambers in London, or my Victorian Bar email address at the Victorian Bar in Australia, or through the universities that I'm connected to. As I say, I'm delighted to support this campaign. I'm delighted to have been given the opportunity to speak. And I very much hope in the foreseeable future, we will have a Bill of Rights for women. Thank you.